Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. The Hey Chaplain podcast brings you stories and wisdom about life in law enforcement, giving support and encouragement to those who wear the badge. In the past, we've had a limited way to talk about trauma and distress, which was helped over 40 years ago when we began using the term PTSD in some situations. But this term doesn't fully cover what every first responder might be going through, and I want to introduce you to some of these newer terms and concepts. My guest today is Debra Fontes. She is a law enforcement chaplain in Sacramento, California, and trains other chaplains. One of the topics she teaches on is the subject of moral injury. Moral injury is not PTSD, though it may occur at the same time and come from the same event. Listen to Debra as she walks me through some of the similarities and differences between post-traumatic stress injury and moral injury. Today, you'll hear Debra give encouragement to those who have suffered trauma and challenge police chaplains to speak life and health into officers' lives. Also, listen for the distinction between feeling guilt over something and feeling shame, and what effect that has on an officer at home. Here's Debra Fontes. Well, welcome, Debra. I'm glad you're on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jared. Thank you for having me. I so appreciate this opportunity.
Well, fantastic. Well, I'm eager to talk about moral injuries and hopefully improve our vocabulary of, what these things are and what they mean. And we throw all these terms around. I feel like generally, especially if someone's not actively working in the field of, psychological health and wellness, that you just hear a term like PTSD and, well, that's kind of the catch-all for all the different psychological problems and dilemmas and whatever. So can you help me with some of the definitions of things like moral suffering, moral distress, and moral injury?
So let me start with moral injury, and then you kind of understand what are some of the effects that happen when someone has been morally injured.
Okay.
Moral injury occurs when now this is an individual that perpetrates, we bear witness to, or we fail to prevent an act or transgression that has impacted us, deeply held values that we hold true for ourselves. So it's our core values that have been violated in some way, and we all have them. There are non-negotiables for all of us. For some, it's honesty. Others, it's loyalty. And so when we see that happening, whether we did it or we witnessed it, and we fail to act upon it, that is moral injury.
So somebody is witnessing a death or tragic injury, but it could also be a coworker being dishonest and acting immorally or that kind of thing.
Yes, or watching, or you doing that, right? You are normally like honesty. You're all about integrity. You're above board, and then somebody asks you, what was your role to play in this situation? And instead of being truthful, you kind of don't give all the details.
Right.
You admit some of the details. And so inside you kind of have that rub of, I know I did something wrong. And so with our officers and our first responders, these are men and women that are above board in integrity and honesty, and they serve the community and they serve one another. But then when they start to go down that road of, well, I committed that, I did that and I didn't do anything. It starts to erode their confidence. It starts to maybe question, like, I'm not the person who I thought I was. And then we start to see that just keep having that impact upon their lives. It starts to impact them personally and professionally, because if I've already compromised here, where else am I going to compromise?
Yeah. So a lot of people probably don't use terms like moral injury or moral distress, but they do maybe think in terms of being compromised, where I used to have certain level of standards, but then, I had a sergeant and we kind of fudged on some numbers, and then it led to this, and then I had to cover for somebody who was lying, and it just starts to snowball, and you feel deeply compromised, and you start to change how you feel about yourself and that kind of thing. I mean, that compromise idea is probably what people are more familiar with, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So in some of the literature, it seems like there is a distinction, again, thinking in terms of defining our terms. Moral distress seems to be what some people talk about when they're discussing, failing a moral dilemma. And it's sometimes mundane circumstances, right? Where it's lying on a report or covering for a coworker or whatever. Some of those things seems to be more moral distress, where at least some authors, it seems like moral injury, they kind of reserve for the violence and death related incidences. Do you find that to be accurate, or do you use them interchangeably?
Yes. So moral injury usually does refer to, violence or death-related incidents. But on the other hand, moral distress refers to dilemmas that create that disequilibrium inside of us.
Yeah.
So it's usually experienced by, multiple, mundane events that our first responders usually are experiencing in line of duty. So, for instance, our first responders, especially for officers, if you're just out of the academy and you're in your, phase 1 of patrol training, and you're with your FTO, and you want to do a great job. You are called to do this, and so you went through the academy and you spent those 6 months or however long you're in your academy, and you're doing everything that you can to be that model officer, that individual that your family knows you to be, right?
Yeah, meet that ideal that you have for yourself.
Yes. And then something goes wrong. You had to use, go hands-on with someone. And so the type of force that had to be implemented, the type of aggression you had to use, it may not align with who you are inside. And you might be thinking to yourself, I didn't handle that situation very well.
Yeah.
So now what? Right? So those are the type of things that the day-to-day that erode an officer's countenance, erode their ability to think clearly. And so moral injury is very interesting to me because, most people don't realize it, but the more time I spend with officers and just listen to their stories, the more I realize they're not questioning the career. They're questioning themselves.
Yeah.
Did I do a good job?
Yeah. Well, and even their identity, because I've heard multiple cases of officers who get into a violent situation and they have to use force and they're fighting for their lives. And when they injure or even kill the person they're fighting, there's this sense of euphoria that rushes in. And you got all these chemicals in your brain and everything that's happening physiologically. But then they're like really happy that they won. And then they feel shame that they felt happy about doing that because they did not become a cop to hurt people. That's not what they wanted to do. And so there's this conflict, and it's like, is that who I am? Am I happy that I hurt somebody? That's not what I thought I was yesterday. And they wrestle with that, and that causes moral injury.
Exactly.
And all of this describes moral suffering.
Yes.
My sense of right and wrong is violated, and now I'm deeply affected by it. And boy, that just starts to have this list of problems. Now, before we get to that list, we're describing, life and death situations and more mundane things, all of which cause moral suffering. Both the moral injuries and moral distress cause moral suffering. How is that different than PTSD?
So glad you brought up PTSD, because also people seem to think that is similar to moral injury when it's not. So PTSD is an immediate injury of trauma. Okay. So moral injury is you're the only one that really is aware that you're impacted by something, right? You're the only one that is feeling that guilt. And then that's when that moral injury comes into play, because guilt, you know that you are not honest. And you know that is one of your core values.
Which doesn't show up on a brain scan.
But with PTSD, your brain is impacted by that trauma. Whether it was a shooting, whether it was a dead baby call, a homicide, a suicide that you was your first one.
Right.
It is the visual and emotional and cognitive impact of that trauma that is from PTSD. Where moral injury, it does impact you, but it's not inhibiting your brain to suppress fear. You're not getting flashbacks. You're feeling guilt maybe,
right?
But it's not impacting you when you're having nightmares about it necessarily. But PTSD is an immediate injury of the trauma.
All right, help me see if I'm getting close to this. Tell me, correct me where I go wrong here. So PTSD is a dysfunction in my brain that, and its ability to properly handle fear and emotions and memory, and that's the flashbacks and nightmares and that kind of thing. But moral suffering is more like this inner voice problem where now I'm not sure how I feel about me and my identity and my shame and my guilt and that kind of stuff, right? And so is that am I barking up the right tree here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. So again, with moral injury, this is something, because we all have our core values, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and we've all taken those tests where you list what's near and dear to you. What are your non-negotiables that you adhere to? And so when we violate those, because those are very personal to us, they're a core value of who we are.
Right.
They identify us and help us to be the people that we know we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we violate one of those, whether it's us not involving ourselves to correct the situation, or we ourselves are the ones that are perpetrating it,
right,
failing to do so, that is where the moral injury comes into play, because we did not respond or react the way we know we should have.
Right.
Possibly. Right.
So PTSD could happen also in the same incident, or one or the other, but they're not the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Post-traumatic stress, now they call it injury, post-traumatic stress injury. If you suffer with post-traumatic stress injury, you're not broken. I want to make that really clear, is that, there is help, and there are really great therapists and counselors out there that are able to work effectively with people that suffer with that. And it's important that they understand that they are not alone and that they can have a life. They just have to learn how to, utilize coping skills that they'll be given, obviously, but to work towards so that they can be healthier for their families. I mean, it is a work in progress. I mean, our brains are very complex. Mm-hmm. Our brains are incredible in healing if we give it the opportunity to do so.
Right.
But just like with moral injury, we have to be willing to open that door and walk through it and do the work.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, hiding from it's not going to help. No.
Exactly. And I think for most people, if they understood that this is what I'm dealing with versus thinking I'm broken, something's wrong with me, I can much rather walk through that door with someone knowing that, what are some of the things I need to do now to take back some control where I've lost control, mm-hmm. right? Well, PTSD, I mean, flashbacks and nightmares and the hypervigilance of not being able to feel normal.
Right.
Everywhere there's a bad guy, there's something that's about to happen at any moment. That's how your brain is treating every situation. As every situation is life or death.
Right.
That's not moral injury. So PTSD is definitely something that, the brain has been altered. So it's now receiving signals as everything is a potential threat to me.
Right.
Where moral injury is not. We're doing it to ourselves.
Right. Okay. That's good. So PTSD is maybe a little more toward the fight or flight kind of instinctual sort of thing, where the moral injury is more the inner voice. How do I feel about myself? What am I saying? What's that inner dialogue? What's going on there? So it's mm-hmm. two different things happening.
Yes.
So can you help me with the psychological components of moral injury? Like what are those symptoms and effects that come from that?
Guilt, the shame, moral concerns, feeling betrayed, loss of trust, difficulty forgiving, losing meaning and purpose in your life, and self-condemnation.
Yeah. Okay.
Those are all things that could point to clinical outcomes, symptoms like PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, relationship problems,
right.
physical pain, and also physical disability. So those are some of the things that psychologically we can be impacted by overall. But again, it's understanding that, we're all in this life just trying to do the very best we can.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great that we have our core values that guide us and direct us and give us purpose. But it's when we derail ourselves by thinking, I've already compromised here, I've already went down that road, there's no turning back, it's done for me, it's over for me. I don't think people really understand that, that's not a healthy mindset. Right. Every day we get to make new choices each and every day. And I think as chaplains, our obligation to our officers is to always remind them that it's never too late.
Yeah. Today is a new day. We can start doing healthy things right now. We can't change the past, but we can start being healthy today. And
I can only do better if I know better. Right.
Yeah.
And I commit to doing that every day. I'm not going to hit it out of the park every day, but I'm going to get pretty close. And it's being vulnerable. And that's one thing our officers are taught not to be.
Oh, no. Yeah.
So
and
it's
it's not just a pride thing either. I mean, sometimes it is. They don't want to look weak, but
Exactly.
but you don't want to be that officer that gets a fit for duty report and can't go out and contribute to the team. And especially when every department is undermanned, you feel like you're letting them down. And so you've just got to tough it out. And that, at least that's the feeling. And in many places, still the culture is that you just got to, bite your lip and grin and bear it and keep at it. And that's really, it leaves a wake of damage and debris behind them.
It sets them up to fail.
Let me circle back on the psychological components. We've mentioned it a couple times now already, guilt and shame. Can you clarify the difference between guilt and shame?
So guilt basically says, I did something bad. Guilt is like, oh, yeah, I messed up there. But what we don't want is it turning into shame, where shame says, I am bad.
Oh, okay.
Because shame means then if I'm bad, then what hope is there for me?
Right. Yeah,
right.
That change in identity informs your future.
Yes.
Right.
And then you start to see depression setting in, anxiety. You'll start to hear loved ones saying they're not how they used to be. They're no longer part of the family. They come home and all they do is spend time on their phone, or they're talking to their buddies about work. They don't hang out with the kids anymore. They, miss family dinner time. And so they start to check out because they realize that for themselves, if they are starting to feel shame and they are bad, then I'm not good enough to be around my own family.
Right.
So I'm and they shut down, and in their own way, they think they're protecting them, but they're not.
Right. Yeah, I'm protecting my family from me because I'm a bad person now.
Exactly.
Right.
And they're creating a void of obviously not communicating, but they're creating that void of, because your loved one isn't a mind reader. They would love to know what's on your mind.
Right.
But, again, it's not really taught how to communicate with your spouse and your loved one to help you. And I think that's, again, as a chaplain, it's one of those things that you have privy to. You have the honor and the privilege to be able to speak life and hope into our officers and into their families versus the narrative of what we see today.
Okay. Now, alongside the psychological component of moral injury, there's also a religious component there too. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that?
You start to question your faith. You start to question, am I a person of faith?
Yeah.
Or you might start to internalize that and become angry at God, thinking, well, you said, you're going to be here with me, and yet this happened and I'm feeling horrible. And so we start to deflect our guilt, and then it starts to turn into anger. We self-blame. We might be remorseful. And again, that's survivor's guilt. Or we start to withdraw from our faith and our religion because we think that, well, I'm beyond that redemption because I've already crossed that barrier. Not only did I violate my own, but I also maybe have violated, one of the 10 Commandments. And so what's the point? What's the point of all this? Right.
Right. Yeah, and that hurts my heart. I would hope that people of faith who are Christian would understand grace and could understand how that would apply to them. And I really would hope that any person, religious or not religious, I would hope that they would understand the work that they do is done under the authority of the government, and the government has the authority to take away people's freedom and to do violence and do that kind of thing for the sake of a greater good. And that they could work out a moral, like, okay, yes, I had to fight this person, or yes, I had to witness, this tragic death or whatever it was, but I was doing that as part of the system to help society. And I would hope that they could work that out, especially Christians, but really, like I said, really anybody. I hope that they could figure that out as far as like, am I one of the good guys or not? Because that's kind of a religious question, really. Am I one of the good guys? Define good.
Yes.
Is there such a thing as a good guy, or are we just different teams of bad guys? Right.
Right. Exactly.
And
exactly.
so can I work that out in my head? And I would hope that chaplains could do that for people, even the non-religious folks, that they could help them work out a religious answer to a religious question, even if the person doesn't practice an organized religion. And so,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people start to lose, because at some point, whether they haven't been to church in years, but they grew up with some faith background in their home.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that they cling to. Maybe subconsciously they're not aware that is what's grounding them until they have something that happens, and then it starts to, like, that reality of, is this really real? Do I believe what I thought I believed?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And again, no officer should ever feel guilty about winning a fight.
Right.
Their job and their promise to their families is to come home.
Right.
And whether or not the person that they're engaged with dies, this is the one thing that I will, that I share with officers quite often, actually, when there are calls that don't end well. Mm-hmm. The end result is not what they wanted. It's that you are not responsible for the consequences of other people.
Yeah.
You are responsible to show up and do your job.
Right.
So you get the call, you respond, you show up, and you do everything possible that you can do to help, to aid, to save a life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it is the people that called you there that brought you into their world, and you're not responsible for the outcome. You're only responsible for what you show up to do.
Yeah, I've talked to several officers who have, had that outpouring of emotion when they've been in a fight and they've had to do violence to somebody, whether it was fatal or not. And there's that outpouring of emotion that says, why did you make me do this? And as strange of a, internal dialogue as they're having, I do appreciate that is the right way to think about it. That this person who was violating the law, and you're commissioned to keep the peace and to uphold the law, and that person's actions is what caused this interaction to happen. And they are responsible for that outcome. You were there to protect the society and to uphold the law. And so yes, why did they make you do this? And that's probably a better way to think about it than to start changing your identity and say, okay, I'm a person who does violence, I'm a bad guy, and you start going down that road. Yeah. Exactly.
Because the minute they start to second guess themselves, whether the moral injury, occurred a while ago, and now it's just, you just kind of like, whatever, what's the point, right? I'm just going to show up, answer calls, do whatever I've got to do. They have to have in their mindset, they need to do all that they can to be present, to take care of themselves, to take care of their partners, the community that they're sworn to protect. And so I think our officers are sometimes at a disadvantage because they just feel so alone, right? And now they're beating themselves up.
Yeah.
Because of whatever moral injury has occurred. So now not only does the public beat them up, maybe their own department, maybe it's not a healthy department, whatever the case may be. And now I'm beating myself up.
Yeah.
So definitely the moral injury, I find that if more people were aware that I'm doing this to myself. No one else is. It's just me. That they would be much more healthier and have a different perspective of, oh, well, I have an issue here. So how do I right the ship?
Well, let me ask you that. What should someone do if they are listening to this and they're like, man, I've had that inner dialogue going on and I have felt that shame and really questioned who I am and that kind of thing. And maybe I have suffered a moral injury. What should they do?
Definitely, they should find someone to talk to.
Okay.
Hopefully they have a healthy chaplain in their department.
Okay.
A chaplains program that they can reach out to one of their chaplains and have that discussion of like, hey, chaplain, what do I do? Mm-hmm. But if not, and they don't, obviously reaching out to EAP services. I mean, every department has them.
Okay.
So they have the Cortico app. Here in California, we have an app called Cortico, and it's Officer Health and Wellness.
Yeah, we have that in Kansas City too.
See?
Yes. Yep.
So you have a list of clinicians that can certainly help. But even sometimes just talking out with someone that you find to be safe, not trustworthy, because trust is often a misused word.
Okay.
But someone that you can feel safe with, that you know that this person cares about me and not about what I'm about to bring to them. But it's having a plan and taking care of yourself. I think most often officers are really great at always saying, hey, man, if you ever need anything, I'm here for you, right? We hear that all the time, especially when there's, officer suicide in the department or, a shooting of some sort. And it's like, hey, if you need anything, I'm here. But I think one of the things that we don't train ourselves to do a better job is being compassionate towards ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So treat yourself as you would treat a family member or another friend, right? You be that for yourself until you can get help.
Yeah. Yeah.
So giving yourself permission to say, hey, I am not in a good place and I need to cut myself some slack.
Okay. So taking the pressure off yourself, what other ways does that manifest? I mean, so you're taking the pressure off yourself, you're going to make yourself available to talk to somebody who you feel safe with. You might give yourself permission to, back off. Some officers feel like, the whole city will fall apart if I'm not doing, overtime. And really what they need is to go take a vacation.
Yes, exactly.
Or something to that effect, or just spend time with the family or whatever it is. But I mean, they need to learn how to go fishing and not live and breathe at the department with their phone, both phones in their pockets all the time. So are there other ways that what else would that look like?
I think also finding satisfaction and contentment of helping or doing work outside of what you do as a profession, right? Giving time to other organizations that you normally may not have even considered.
Yeah.
Putting those energies into changing your view. Like if I'm always looking at my locker room, my gun belt, my uniforms, my partners, and that's my only world. I don't have anything outside of that. I need to expand my world.
Yeah.
Because your lens now is just very small, right? Yeah. And helping and bringing positivity. And sometimes we have to talk ourselves up, but I think also it's holding ourselves accountable in the areas that we need to grow. So yeah, I had this moral injury. I failed or I watched other people failed and I didn't do anything about it. But if we know, then we're responsible to do something with it. So what can I do to get back on track, right? So I call them protective factors versus the risk factors. So what are my risk factors, right? And that's taking an honest assessment of myself. Mm-hmm. Where have I gone off the rails? And so with every one, so maybe integrity was an issue. And I had that moral failure in this area of integrity. Well, what is the protective factors against that risk factor where I failed? And how do I implement to get that back? So maybe I have to own some stuff. But I've got to be willing to walk down that road and do it.
Right.
And then, getting an accountability person, finding someone that holds you accountable. You have to tell someone. And then maybe having them check in with you maybe once a week, like, hey, did you do that one thing you said you were going to do? Did you have that conversation with that one person?
Yeah. And like we were talking earlier, there's a cultural barrier of entry for that, because in law enforcement, there's this attitude that you can't be vulnerable, that kind of thing we discussed already. And if you can push through that, you find out that, actually, most law enforcement people share some of the very same, misgivings and self-doubts and weaknesses, and they could really help me. And most of the people around me could really identify with what I'm going through if I can be brave enough to push through that and ask for help and find somebody safe to discuss this with. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's also just finding contentment in what you do, right? So if you're got into law enforcement and it didn't turn out the way you thought by now you'd be in a specialty unit, canine, SWAT,
right,
whatever, and it didn't work out for you.
Yeah.
And you start to allow that to get in your head, like, well, what's the point? You really have to understand that I got into this profession for a reason, to help people. Or whatever the case may be, whatever their why is. But I think you have to constantly reevaluate why I do what I do.
Yeah.
And if you're finding that it's just not doing it for you anymore, then maybe it's time to have that discussion with your family, getting them involved in that decision with you.
Right.
But I think if we don't reevaluate, then we never grow and we become stagnant. And then again, the moral injury of, it starts to go down that road of I become angry. I'm, checked out at home. Hostility is growing. I don't have a sense of who I am anymore. Mm-hmm. And I'm questioning if I can trust myself or others. And so then we start to believe the negativity, such as like, I'm weak. I'm not a good person.
I'm some sort of failure because I didn't make the SWAT team. I'm not going to ever get promoted to be the chief, and then therefore I'm a failure. And that's where I try to push officers toward contentment. He is richest who is content with the least. And so understanding that, no, actually, putting in your 20 or 25 years of just keeping the peace and protecting a neighborhood is an incredibly noble and good thing. And so be very content with that and be proud of that. It doesn't have to be, the next episode of Cops. I mean, it can just be kind of mundane and kind of routine, but our society needed you to do that. And that's a good thing. And we can find contentment there. Yeah.
Absolutely. If I'm not careful with how I start to change my perspective and my view, and I'm allowing all these things to start to erode me personally as an individual, I have to be very careful, because then that's where it does lead into depression, right? Yeah. Anxiety, and even beyond to that point of suicide ideation, where if I'm not getting help and I'm not willing to allow people to help me, then I enter a very dangerous path of self-harm.
Right.
And we always want to make sure that we are always promoting wellness and health for our officers. And so I think it's important to understand that while they may be dealing with the day-to-day of the job and dealing with the day-to-day of dealing with partners and administration and whatnot, that it is so important that we not allow this be the defining thing about us, that it's too late. It's never too late.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you, Debra. I so appreciate you giving us good definitions and understanding of what moral injuries are. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I want to thank Debra for taking the time to talk with me and to help expand our vocabulary about the kinds of things that affect some law enforcement officers. Like most officer wellness issues, the information on moral injuries started with military veterans and then has trickled down to law enforcement. That means that getting appropriate help to officers has lagged behind. But every year, the kind of help available improves more and more. Please seek out these resources. Use them to bring health and wellness to you, and make sure you find a safe helper to talk to. I want to thank Chaplain Michelle Johnson, also from Sacramento, for introducing me to Debra. Back in August of 2021, she wrote, "I have an amazing chaplain in mind for you to interview. Her name is Debra Fontes, and she is a stellar law enforcement chaplain that I'm honored to serve with." She went on to say that Debra gave the best training on a subject called moral injuries. Well, thanks to Michelle, we were able to get Debra on the show. I want to welcome a surge of new listeners in places like California, Arizona, and Louisiana, as well as a good number of listeners from Canada. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and thank you for sharing it with others. Remember, if you liked what you heard here, please share this episode with a cop or someone who loves a cop. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
I would think that officers would understand that when they drive up to a scene, it's chaotic and people are yelling at each other. We are dealing with the exact same thing. And oftentimes as soon as it started, so nobody has calmed down. There's that misunderstanding that, oh, why didn't the dispatcher get this piece of information? Well, my call taker is trying. They're trying, yes. But a caller is just, all they're saying is, get him out here, get him out here, get him out here.
Right.
And that's all they're saying.
Right. Because you're just listening.
Exactly.
You only have one sense to work with. Yeah.
And as much as we want to try to get as much of information, because we know what information to get for our officers, but a lot of times our callers are not cooperative.
The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guests and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. Thank you for listening today, and as always, pray for peace in our city.